This episode is brought to you in part by Museum of the Bible and its new worship experience, All Creation Sings, made in partnership with Creator. Step into an immersive room with vibrant visuals, soundscapes of praise, and interactive displays illuminating the story of worship. Get tickets at museumofthebible.org/ACS.
Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast, where I sit down with a guest to explore hard faith questions and the beauty of God's grace in our lives. I am your host, Amber Cullum, and today I have a practical and needed conversation for you. I sit down with Ryan Rush, author of Restore the Table, a book that explores the transformative power of intentional meal gatherings. Ryan's insights come from personal experience and an experiment he conducted at Kingsland Baptist Church. We discuss how the tables of our past shape our present, the timeless example set by Jesus, and practical tips for creating meaningful mealtime habits in our fast-paced digital world. You will also briefly hear me discuss a weekly meal my family practices, Shabbat. I have a free resource that further describes how we've managed to have an intentional meal leading into Sabbath on a weekly basis since 2019. To learn more and download the free resource, visit graceenoughpodcast.com and click Curious About Practicing Sabbath on the homepage. That link can also be found in the show notes. Good morning, Ryan, and welcome to the Grace Enough podcast.
Good morning, Amber. I'm so glad to be with you.
We today are going to talk about a book that you have written and also a little bit of the ministry that you have. But before we ever even get into that, I'd love to hear from people how they began walking with Jesus. What did your early faith journey look like?
Well, thanks for asking, Amber. I'm thrilled to be with you today. I was raised in a religious home. Like we went to church. We actually helped to start a church when I was a kid. But I never heard the gospel in a way that I understood it. So not to take away from the churches I was a part of, I just didn't understand. My sister went to a church camp after we moved when I was 11 years old. She was 13. She was a mess. I mean, for a 13-year-old. And I think part of the reason we moved was because my parents were trying to get her out of the environment she was in. She came home from this camp, woke me up that night and said, "Ryan, I have to tell you, I became a Christian." And I said, "Holly, and I don't know what you thought we were before, but we were Christians before. We were a Christian family." She said, "No, I met Jesus. I learned about the grace of God, and it was just like Greek to me." So she talked me into going to another camp a few weeks later, and I heard the gospel in a way I understood. I received the Lord by faith. So 11 years old.
Wow.
So the really cool thing about that story was about 6 months later, our entire family, my mom, dad, my sister, and myself were baptized together. And so it was really a before and after story of a transformed home that I get to live out. And now I'm a pastor. And I mean, this is a lot of years later, but my parents are members of my church. So I get to be my parents' pastor, which is kind of crazy to look out at 11 o'clock and see your mom and dad in the congregation.
Gosh, so maybe
totally
it's
full circle.
Yeah, I should be having this conversation with your mom maybe because
I know.
I'd love to hear those perspectives though, because it's like, honestly, she probably just sees a whole different side that you probably aren't even privy to, honestly.
You're probably right. Yeah.
I mean, because as parents, my kids are young, but it's hard to understand how your kids really are always your kids until you start watching them get older. And then you're like, oh, that's why when they're in their 20s and 30s, my mom is still trying to tell me different things that I should be doing because, you watch these little babies grow up and
right.
they're your people.
Exactly. I know. And it's very perceptive because my parents have a unique role to play here. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that a lot of people know them as Ryan's parents now after all these years. And they have to endure that, but they are pretty great. And they could out me at any time. I mean, they have so many stories on me of crazy things I did and how I was in trouble. So I have to be very nice to my parents or they could mess me up. Yeah.
Oh, I think it's awesome. We don't have our parents living near us. And so that's just a real gift that it's probably easy to take for
Hmm.
granted. But sometimes we're like, oh, we wish one set of our, we
Right.
wish we lived close to at least one set. But
Yeah.
that's not where we are right now. So, anyways, well, thank you for sharing that. Today, we're actually going to talk about the powerful connections that take place around a table when sharing a meal. And this is something that I
Hmm.
also feel very, very strongly about because I too have seen
Yeah.
transformation and really not just transformation take place, but really just lifelong appreciation and openness that can take
Hmm.
place around a table. And so, will you let's start off with just what kind of got you so interested in this? Because I know that you have a wonderful backstory that's kind of laid the foundation for a book that you've written.
Sure. So I could talk about my own family, but before I do
Hmm.
that, let me back up to I guess it is
Sure.
still my own family, but my nuclear family, my origin family that I mentioned a while ago. My mom was a great cook. She
Mm.
had traveled all over the world before
Oh, wow.
she graduated high school. Her father was in the army, and so she picked up all these different ideas and menus and recipes. In my early memories, I can remember being at my grandparents' house with her as they cooked these exotic meals from Japan or Germany or all over the place. And so it was out of that I really sort of built an identity, if you will, understanding where
Mm.
I was from and who these people were. My father was from a farming community in Indiana where they even started further back than that. So they were actually pulling the plants from the ground
Yeah.
and raising the meat. And so when
Yep.
you sat around a table, it had a completely different perspective. And
Mm.
so that was very important to me. Now, I already mentioned before Christ, we were a very busy family. We had a little bit different priorities. And so we didn't have a lot of meal times around the table on a regular basis at home until we came to Christ. And when the Lord kind of transformed our home when I was about 11 years old, a lot changed in
Mm.
that regard. And so I have some very treasured moments of building my character, my identity, my values around a table growing up. So fast forward to when my wife and I had our children, our daughters. Uh, some of the most meaningful times that we
Mhm.
experienced with our girls were around that table.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how, for a long time, and I think this is still pretty popular. The church talked about having family devotions as a household. Those are great. They didn't really work for me. And I'll tell you why. I was a pastor. I was talking about family ministry. And every time we tried to pull that off, it was contrived. Really,
Yep.
Dad, you're just working on a lesson so that you can use it on Sunday. And in fact, when Reagan was 5, I was going over the devotion for my sermon on Sunday, and Reagan actually put her fork down, 5 years old, and said, "Dad, if you don't know what to say, maybe they should just get somebody else to preach," because she was so tired of me just going over. Like, I'm just trying to get her material. So it just didn't work. But something happened. We came around the meal.
Yeah.
Then it felt like, okay, we're eating, we're having conversation. And now we pull out a book and say, what do you girls think about this topic? Or did you see this on the news today as I got older? And how do you feel about this? What does God say about this? Then all of a sudden it had a completely different flair than if you'd had what you'd call a devotion or a time where you shut everything down because you had a purpose for being there. And the mealtime created this mechanism for faith transference that I'd never seen before.
Mm. I like that you say faith transference because I think that sometimes we can think that it has to be like, okay, I have this one scripture and this is what we're going to talk about.
Right.
Because I mean, I've felt that before. Oh
Yeah.
no, we're not doing this and we need to be doing this certain thing. But same around our table, we currently have a 13, 11, and an 8-year-old. And some of the most
Awesome.
meaningful conversations really do come out of, something that happened at school. And then
Yep.
if we have a mindset of, well, what does that tell us about God? What about that story is true and right and
Yes.
beautiful? And what is not true, wrong, and
Yeah.
ugly? You can have spiritual conversations.
I love that, Amber, because you don't need a lesson plan. You really don't. Now, we'd
Mm-mm.
have a stack of books usually on our table that had like, I mean, there used to be some Focus on the Family, I think, put out something called Sticky Situations. They may still exist, where they'd say, okay, you're in class and somebody tries to cheat off of your test. What are you going to do? And stuff like that. But so sometimes we'd pull those up, but a lot of times it was just having conversations about the day. Almost every time we sat down for a meal, we would do high-low. So, I mean, this is so
Same.
cheesy, but we'd say, what's
No,
the
we do
best
too.
thing that happened today? What's the worst thing that happened today? And it was just out of that everything
Yep.
flowed. It just happened naturally.
Yeah, we do that same thing now, and it's hilarious to me that you mentioned sticky situations.
Right?
Because I've had it passed down to me from a best friend that's like 7 years ahead of me.
I love it.
And
Yeah.
but during COVID, I would go off on these rants because I would be like, "Okay, wait a minute. I know that's a sticky situation, but maybe we misapplied this verse a little bit. So let's talk about what that verse means." Because
That's so great.
I can be kind of big about like, let's be careful that it's not behavior management and like
Right.
what's the heart of the issue here? Like, why do we
Sure,
not want to
sure.
do those things? But anyways, that also is a side note. And
That's so
so
great. I actually brought that up in the book. I don't know if I mentioned sticky situations in the book, but the idea, and years later, our older girls are now 30 and 27. So
I
they look
love it.
back on those and they say, "Oh, Dad, it actually happened. Like I went to this party and this thing took place." So they're pretty crafty. Good idea.
Yeah, it is. It's funny. I mean, it's helpful, but it's also like there's some cheesiness to it because I have the one
Oh,
that's
no doubt
still
about
from
it.
like the
Yeah,
90s, my kids are like,
exactly.
that's not really what's gonna
Right,
happen,
right.
Mom. And I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah,
it is. It's just it looks different.
that's
That's all."
hilarious.
Yeah. But anyway, so when it comes to restoring the table
Hmm.
and that
Yep.
being the title of your book, I guess what I want to ask about restoring the table, that there is an idea there that something is lost.
Hmm.
And so what is lost and in what ways are we trying to restore it?
And there are at least two different layers to that. First
Mhm.
of all, I mean, the most practical level is I think that research bears out the fact that families are not eating together as much as they used to. I talk about some of those statistics in the book, but we can pretty much see that anecdotally everywhere. People just look around and say, "Well, I mean to eat together. I know that we need to eat together, but we just don't have
Yeah.
time." So we need to restore the table in that way. But there's a second level of that. There's a deeper sense of restoring the table because I recognize that we are also, in a sense, in a crisis of family, in our
Yeah.
culture today. And there's a lot of people who have pain related to their past or their home or what have you. And so when they think about the memories around a table or in their homes, there can be some hurt there. And the good news is that God has the power to restore every one of those tables, right?
Mhm.
Every one of them. And I get to tell lots of stories in the book about people who God has completely restored, who used to look back and think that kind of life was over. They were telling themselves some narratives that were
Mm.
debilitating and not true about God and about their future.
Mm.
This episode is brought to you in part by Beyond Ordinary Women Ministries, which prepares Christian women for leadership. At BOW, we believe that every woman is a leader because she influences someone. So, whom do you influence? Do you mentor a woman? Serve in the workplace? Or do you lead a small group, teach the Bible, or even lead an entire ministry? No matter who or how many you influence, our free online resources will help equip you. Our videos, podcast episodes, and articles from experienced women leaders will encourage you and perfect your leadership skills. They offer wisdom for dealing with ministry pitfalls, current biblical issues, health for your own soul, and insights for shepherding others well. In addition, BOW offers Bible studies designed to connect women of multiple generations. They provide a challenge to both women new to the Bible and those wanting to dig deeper. Be our guest and browse all of our free resources and low-cost Bible studies at beyondordinarywomen.org.
Something about the table too that can happen a lot of times is when you're in a situation where let's say you're with people that you sat around a table with in the past, and you talk a little bit about how our past tables that we've sat around can really impact our present, which is what you just said as well.
Yep.
But I think we think about holidays. And how that can turn
Mhm.
into political talk or, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, I don't want to go be with that person or, whatever that is. But it goes a lot further beyond that. And so, what are some ways that someone, let's say right now, like they know I want to be sitting around a table more
Mhm.
because I've heard the impact that it has and I believe it, but I'm still struggling to really make it happen. What would you say to them?
Okay, so first of all, Amber, from a practical standpoint, there's so much research now. I'm talking about
I know.
secular, extra biblical research that demonstrates 5 meaningful meal times a week with other people makes a huge difference
Mhm.
in child development, in self-image, and everything else. Now we know that we can also look at the scripture and we can see scads of examples of how meal times were really, really important.
Yeah.
So it's worth the effort to do that. The other aspect of that is people are already having meals. I mean, I know very few people who do not eat, and so we're eating, and all we have to do is just take that habit that we already have and find a way creatively to make sure that those meal times become meaningful in their activity. That means we're intentional about the time. We eliminate the distractions and we invite the Lord to the conversation. So you're already
Mhm.
eating, and you can do that. But when we talk about how to restore them, I think part of that intentionality is to say, okay, let's think about who's going to be around the table. There's some who are listening or watching who would say, I'm living alone, in this season.
Mhm.
I don't know who that would be. We have really, a lot of strife in our homes right now. Okay, well then, can you be intentional about who else you bring to the table?
Mhm.
Amber, you mentioned a situation that so many people deal with. Your extended family's not around where you
Yeah.
live right now.
Mhm.
So wouldn't it be something if you could bless an older couple in your area by saying, "Hey, would you join us at the table a couple times a
Yeah.
week?" And then all of a sudden you have a built-in mechanism for conversation because you just asked them their story. Or what's the
Mhm.
what's the biggest mistake you ever made in your life? What are you most proud of? Just simple questions that you could ask that are going to engage your whole family in a different way than if it had just been yourselves at the table. So
Mm.
you can restore the table by bringing some models to the table, maybe that have walked a different path that they can share their own story. So there's just a few examples, but there's so many ways you can do this. The most important thing that we have to remember is the table's worth restoring. It
Mhm.
doesn't matter how difficult your past has been or how out of the habit you've become. It's worth restoring, and the research bears that out.
I know for me, as a busy mom and wife, I think the barrier at times is, silly things. Let me point that out, but they don't feel silly.
Mhm.
Oh, my house isn't prepared. I don't know what to cook. I'm not a good cook. I really just don't want more children running in my house. And this is like inviting other people in. And you can speak to that as well, but I
Sure.
just want to say getting to that place of saying those are my own insecurities when most people who are invited to the table really don't care about those things. They
Right.
really don't. Like I have learned pulled pork in a crock pot, nobody really cares if it tastes that great.
Right.
If you're having meaningful conversations around the table, most people just want to enjoy fellowship with others.
That's
You
really
know?
true, and I'll even add, Amber, that you're communicating something really healthy when you invite somebody over to your house and the laundry basket is still on the couch, like because you're saying, "Listen, this is real life, and we don't have to pretend like everything is as it appears on Instagram, and
For
we're just
sure.
real people, and so let's have real conversations." So it actually can drive a better conversation when everything's not spick and span.
And invite other people to bring things, right? Like most people are like, "Sure, I'll show up with something that it doesn't have to be fancy." I've learned like
Sure,
just ask,
sure.
especially when it's a full um other people are in busy seasons and they
Mhm.
usually get it. And they're actually more willing to bring things and participate when you're the type of person who doesn't act like you have it all together.
Right.
So
Well, a closely related element to this, Amber, is even if it's your own family, a special or meaningful mealtime doesn't have to be at home, even. It could be,
true.
or it doesn't have to be dinner. It could be breakfast.
Yep.
It could be at Chick-fil-A. It could be a lot of places. The idea is that you're intentionally together, you scheduled the moment, and you remove the distractions.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about that a bit too, about how do you get in those 5, meaningful meals a week? Because for families, but I don't want this to just be
Mhm.
geared towards families because there's a
Sure.
wide variety of people who listen. Sometimes breakfast is the best for people. Sometimes a weekend lunch is the best for people. But talk about that a little bit. How do people go about managing their schedule, looking for ways to insert those meaningful meals?
Right. 5 can either seem like a ridiculously low bar or a
Yeah,
daunting mountain, depending on your perspective or where you're
it's
coming
true.
from. But 5 is possible. I didn't pull 5 out of a hat. I'm not pretending that that's a biblical number. What I'm saying is that the research bears out that when you get to 5, some meaningful things happen when you have those meal times with others
Mm,
in an intentional way. So, first of all, get intentional about looking at your schedule at openings and opportunities that will happen naturally. So, let's say that's Sunday after church. Okay, we're already gathering. This has been especially helpful for people in our church who are single or living
mhm,
alone right now. And when we have these challenges at Kingsland and we say, hey, we want you to have 5 meaningful meal times with the ones you love every week. We intentionally use that wording, and that's the wording I use in the book because anybody can do that. You can find people that you can connect with intentionally who may not be family members or close family members. So, number one, Sunday after church. If you're a part of a church, that's a natural time. You can grab 2 or 3 other people and you can go. Or if you bring your family and maybe invite another family with you. Then you say, okay, what is the practice schedule or rehearsal schedule or whatever? If you have young kids like you do that you're working with already, or is there a natural place where this is right by where the practice field is or whatever that we can gather and we can say every Monday we're going to do this. Now, Wednesday evening, for a lot of people in our community here is a time where they are a part of church activities at our
mhm,
congregation. We have a meal here, so that's a built-in freebie for especially singles or those living alone. We already have tables set up. We have the food. Just come sit and enjoy the company
mhm.
there. So now you're 3 in. Okay, so now you're looking at, okay, can you find game night or a meal night where you can say, this is going to be the night for our family. We're going to get together and do this thing, or with the ones you love.
Mhm.
Now, for others, you may say, okay, the other meaningful meal times might happen at work, at lunch,
Yeah.
where I'm going to find a couple of coworkers who I want to speak into their lives and invite them to speak into mine. You might do it that way. And so you start looking at those natural places and you can get there. If you have young kids at home, though, I'm just going to say, you can make it happen. You might have to say no to some things to make it happen, but
True.
it's worth making it happen. So that's a little different. But everybody else, yeah, you can get creative. There's ways to make that take place.
Absolutely. I mean, we are in the throes of practices and all the things, and we've just had to adapt. And that's
Mhm.
I've spoken to a couple of friends and said, meal planning has saved my life, quite literally. And so because I know on Saturday and Sunday when I sit down, I know what
Yeah.
every night of my week for the next 7 days looks like as far as in who's going to be home, what food's going to be on the table, when we need to eat out. It frees up so much, and I get so much less stressed because I know, okay, this week on Wednesday, it's gonna be the only night all 5 of us are gonna be together, so we'll definitely be around the table. But on Tuesday, just because my daughter is in gymnastics doesn't mean the other 4 of us aren't gonna be around the table, So there's some little
Right.
things like that too, where just realizing that's a season that will
Yes.
change.
Right. We have great memories with our girls having meaningful meal times with the back of the minivan opened up in a
Yes.
parking lot of a barbecue restaurant on the way to something. And we just had a little picnic there and had conversation. It was wonderful. So some of those are the best meal times.
It is true. Every Friday night, we do a Shabbat meal kicking into Sabbath, and we've done
Wow.
it since before COVID started. And honestly, that is something else I would speak into is just habits. Habits really do matter,
Yep.
whether they're
Yep.
good or
I love
bad,
that.
you know? And so now, like my kids are the ones when we miss that are disappointed. And so often they're excited to invite other people in, even though I'm the one that just wants to keep it our family because I'm tired. And they're like, but let's invite so and so over. And so I agree with you on all the things. There's
That's
just a
fantastic,
lot of
Amber.
ways. Well, thank you. I
Yeah.
mean, it's been a lifeline for us, honestly. And I think once you build habits,
Hmm.
that's what they become when they're healthy, right? Is
Well,
that
you're not just
they're
building any
meaningful.
habit. Yes, you're
Yes.
building a habit around a mealtime. And when you talk about Sabbath and the Shabbat
Mhm.
meal, you go back to, it reminds me of Exodus chapter 12. Probably the most important, significant meal in history, the Passover meal that was implemented by God to say, this is how you'll remember. Of all the different mechanisms he could have used to say, I want to pass on my grace, my mercy, my judgment, all the different characteristics I have, so that generation after generation understand the significance of this. He used a meal.
He did.
And guess what? There's not been a generation since that has not observed the Passover meal. And in some ways, that meal becomes obviously very precious to the Christian church
Absolutely.
because of the Lord's Supper. And so we're still experiencing this mealtime to remember something very significant about God. So that's how important it is. So you've actually captured some of that in your own family that you can't go wrong. Like it's so abundantly biblical and significant in the life of a family. And somehow we've forgotten that.
Yeah, it's something, I mean, the Jewish people do very, very well keeping that a priority that I definitely want us
That's
to
good.
continue to adopt. But when we think about the Passover, Jesus did often use meal times to build relationships and to build relationships with people who weren't like himself.
Yes.
And you, before we started recording, spoke a little bit about how the area you live in is the most ethnically diverse
Right.
city in America. Talk about that a little bit and how meaningful meal times really is what Jesus used and how
Yeah.
that's a model for us, and maybe a few examples of how that's been used in your area.
No, that's huge. So you look at just the book of Luke. I mean, you could look all over. The book of Luke, if you look at it closely, it's just like a book of meals. Jesus
Yeah.
is constantly at the table with people, very often completely different from him. I mean, it's a totally different worldview, works based, everything else. He's sitting with Pharisees, he's sitting with prostitutes, he's
Mm.
sitting with tax collectors, and he's sitting across a table. There's something about a meal
Mhm.
that brings the barriers down. And I've certainly seen that in my own life. Amber, you mentioned our community. In Fort Bend County, where I live in West Houston, we have the most ethnically diverse community in America, which means I'm more likely to live next door to someone of a different culture than anywhere else in the nation. Obviously,
Mm.
you go to New York, New Jersey, you have ethnic diversity, but you generally have people living in neighborhoods with people who are very homogenous. My next door neighbors are Hindus from India. Their neighbors are from Scotland. Uh, they're religious but not active in a church. Their neighbors are from China. They're atheists. Their neighbors are from Louisiana, and so just a really unique group. COVID created an opportunity
Mhm.
for a lot of neighborhoods and neighbors to come together. So we got to know them in that way. We just sent out a note, put it on doors, said, "Hey, this would be a good time to connect." So we created this text stream, and we become friends. We started to have some gatherings out in the cul-de-sac where we'd share a meal, do different things. Well, something happened last year. This is one of my favorite aspects of the whole year. Our Indian neighbors, Hindu neighbors, sent out a text and said, "Hey, I want to carry on the tradition." So they're using the word tradition of mealtimes together. We're going to host the next one at such and such an Italian restaurant. So they set it up, and they went ahead and said, "Let's just do this quarterly. This is so nice."
So
And every time we
awesome.
get together, somebody shares their story. We have nothing in common except we're sharing food and we share a cul-de-sac. But it's allowed us to have this avenue to share the love of Christ in a way that is incredibly simple. I mean, it's like all the barriers are down, and it's not as though we get up and we preach the gospel to them, but they know our lives and our story now. And I guarantee you, when they have crisis, they're going to call us. And so the Lord has opened this incredible door. So in 3 weeks, we have dinner again with our neighbors that they planned. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's the power of the meal times. I share another story in the book, Amber, right at the beginning that's especially meaningful to me right now because my wife just got on a plane yesterday to go to Somaliland, East
Mm.
Africa,
Yeah.
and she is dedicating a special needs center that's named for our daughter with special needs. It'll be called the Lily Rush Special Education Center in Somaliland, the only one in the entire nation.
Wow.
This is a 100% Muslim nation. I was there a year and a half ago with a group, a contingency with some other dear friends of ours who had lost a son. So we built a school in his memory. So as you can imagine, we have this group of 5 or 6 Christians traveling to a 100% Muslim nation because we share the value of education and they desperately need schools. And so we went, and they're probably rightly so, a little bit leery of us, wondering what our agenda is and what have you. We've not hidden anything. We told them we're Christians. We believe in sharing the love of Christ, but we also respect, their culture and background. So they're just everything's just real formal and stiff and stuffy until we went to dedicate this school, have these precious children around. Then afterward, we go to this town hall to have a meal with the governor, with the Minister of Education of the nation of Somaliland, with the mayor and a bunch of dignitaries, and then we have the Americans. And so we're sitting there, and I'm sitting next to the head of education for Somaliland. And we're having a meal of, I don't know what, there's gravy on probably camel. That camel's the number one staple of the diet. And so I said, tell me about your children. Well, everybody wants to talk about their kids. So he has pictures. Oh, yeah, well, let me show you my kids. Well, how did you get involved in education? So he starts to talk about that. And before long, I'm looking around this table and all the barriers are down and everybody's just people. They're just enjoying company with one another. And we left that room as friends. And I'm telling you, Amber, it wouldn't have happened if there wasn't a meal in front of us. It was this powerful moment where we shared this stuff of life, and we left with a new agenda to build more schools. And that's the reason my wife's on a plane to go meet with people I know who are my friends to dedicate a new school that's going to impact disabled kids and adults in a country where they otherwise wouldn't have. And it all started with a meal.
I love that too, because it really is a demonstration of the kingdom of God going, creating pockets of goodness all around the world. And I feel like that is the best primer for the gospel, period. It matters to use what we have to impact the kingdom of God and to not always just be driven with making sure they get saved. Now, yes, that's the important thing, but those doors open through relationships and just being part of the kingdom of God around the world. And so relationship building, I do think that's what's so beautiful about meals, is because it allows relationships to build in a way that it feels like nothing else can.
Right. I agree. And in some ways, I'm going to use a cheesy illustration that just came to me, so forgive me now. But basically, you're slow cooking evangelism, right? I mean, that's what you're doing because you have relationships rather than having a presentation. And out of that, just going back to the Somaliland model, I'm telling you, I have a prediction, a generation from now, there's going to be revival in Somaliland with people coming to faith in Christ, but because we can already see people exploring these things and who are welcome to the truths of Christ that have never thought about it before. That would not have happened if we went and just gave a sermon in Somaliland. We would have been kicked out of the country.
That's why I feel like I relate to those, verses where Jesus said, you saw me and I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, and so on and so forth, because it really is demonstration of the love that pours forth from our God.
It's
that
really good.
really opens hearts. And so let's close up with this. You also talk quite a bit about, well, I shouldn't say quite a bit, but you talk about conversation starters. And I think that sometimes can be a barrier for people. Like, we're just not sure what to talk about. And you gave a couple great examples of, let's talk about kids, and how did you get into education? But there's some people who just aren't natural. They're not great at facilitating conversation.
Right.
What helps do you provide, and what are some things as you have helped others to engage in meaningful meal times to use in making them actually meaningful, right? It's not the eating that makes them meaningful.
Exactly. And Amber, it's a really good question because the reality is not everybody is a conversationalist. And when you start to do this the first time, it's going to freak some people out. It's going to be so different from anything you ever saw growing up or anything like that. It does not have to be complicated. for that reason, in the back of the book, I put several conversation starters that are there that are fairly, simple. The reason I didn't put a ton is because I think once you get the hang of it, you realize you can do this, but you have 10 or 12 to get started. Likewise, even if somebody doesn't have the book, they can go to restorethetable.com, and there are some conversation starters free there that you can take and you can use, and we'll try to update those regularly. But most importantly, what you want to do is talk about something that will go beyond a yes or no question. That's all you're really doing. You just want to get the conversation flowing. You've already, I hope, prayed, invited the Lord to the meal. And so you're going to go through that filter, and you imagine that the Lord is present at the table. And so you can talk about any topic from then on, So I'll give you an example that just came to my mind. When our girls were in high school, I can remember one particular television show that was big at the time that was not a Christian show, but we were watching together, and it was a good time to watch it because it wasn't all biblical. And what we would do is we would pause and say, wait a second, okay, that's a good time. Like, that's a really deep emotional thing. So let's unpack what she just did with her parents there. And the show was Parenthood, by the way. You don't have to guess what it was.
Yeah.
And so we'd watch this show, and then we'd stop and say, okay, well, let's run this through the filter of what the scripture has to say. And so we weren't endorsing the show necessarily, but what we were doing is talking about real life issues with real life consequences to say, well, that might've been painted in a light like this, no big deal, but let's think about the after effects of such and such. So sometimes that would end up being the conversation at the table. And so it wasn't a conversation card. It'd be, hey, when so-and-so did this, what kind of impact do you think it would have if that happened in our household? I mean, so you're going to have to drive the conversation based on the people around your table as well. But you can also start with simple stuff. Like, I mean, one of the questions in the back of the book that we talk about is, what's the ideal age? If you could be any age, what's the very best age? I mean, that's pretty benign, but it's kind of funny to think about it, and it almost always leads to stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think about when we ask the superhero question, like if you could have any superpower.
Yeah, that's right.
What would it be? And it always facilitates among all ages. Because I have kids at different ages, and then also like I work with youth, so I have youth leaders come into my house. That question, same thing. People are like, "Well, I'd teleport." But why would you teleport when you could do this? I mean, it always ends up in these great conversations. So
Amber, do your listeners already know what your favorite superpower would be, or just going to leave us hanging?
It is teleport. That's why I said that.
Oh, is it really?
Well, because I'm
so
always
interesting.
like, how awesome would it be if you could just be like, hey, I'd like to ski the Alps today. You're just there and you just go ski.
Okay.
And then you're like, and tonight I need to be home to cook dinner. You're home.
It's nice.
All
right.
Awesome. So anyways, it's not like heal the world but maybe it's selfish.
Okay.
Is that selfish?
No, I mean, if heal the world was an option, that's different, but I don't think that it is. So.
That's right. Well, thank you for asking that question. But
all right, sure.
Anyway, okay, so Restore the Table is the website. I'm sure that is where you can also purchase the book, but you can get the book in all the places, right?
Yep, absolutely. RestoreTheTable.com or .org. It goes to the same place, has some information there. And, my prayer is that it will bring families together. Obviously, my agenda goes beyond the table and goes beyond some really good cooking. We long to see families restored and transformed by the power of the gospel. That's our motive.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate the work you're doing.
This was so much fun, Amber. Thanks so much.
I hope my conversation with Ryan has inspired you to rethink the incredible potential Mealtimes hold for building deeper, more meaningful connections. Don't forget to visit graceenoughpodcast.com if you would like to learn more about my family's weekly Shabbat meal and Sabbath practice. On the homepage, click Curious about learning more about Sabbath, or scroll down wherever you're listening and click the link in the show notes.
Thank you for listening to the Grace Enough podcast. Tune in next time.